All right. Well, we've clicked over to 9 o'clock, so I am going to kick this off, everybody. So, hello and welcome to this Learn Live event, Creating Art and Landscape Photography with Long Exposures with me, Meghan Maloney. I'm really excited that you've decided to join me for this workshop. You know, we're all facing a life that looks pretty different to what it did a few months ago. You know, here in New Zealand, we'd actually been enjoying a relatively, free life from restrictions of COVID, and life was feeling pretty normal until a couple of weeks ago. And then we've actually had a resurgence of cases in Auckland. So Auckland's been on lockdown for the last couple of weeks, or I live a couple of hours south. So where I am, we've kind of been still living a relatively normal life, but there's been, you know, everything gets turned a bit upside down. And I know that for all of us all over the world, no matter where you are listening tonight, your life will have been affected in some way. So I think though, what this year has done is it's been a really good reminder that we can come together from across the world to share ideas and learning. And so wherever you are in the world listening to this online workshop, I just want to applaud you for using this time while sort of our normal life is on hold to a certain extent to do something creative, to be inspired and to learn some new skills. So well done, bravo. I'm really glad that you're all here. So I just wanted to quickly run through the schedule and how the workshop will run tonight. So obviously we're kicking off with our introduction now, talk a little bit about sponsors and things, and then we're going to get into the equipment to use for creating long exposures, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about filters and what an important role they play and long exposure work, and then also talk about some settings, go-to settings to use when you are composing your long exposures. We'll have a very I see there I've managed to put 8 o'clock twice, but we'll have a quick break, probably about 5 to 8-ish, depending on how things run to time, and then you're welcome to ask some questions at that point. And then from there we're going to talk about how to compose your long exposures, different techniques that you can use, some challenges that you'll face, and then we are going to spend about half an hour roughly going through processing 3 images, 3 long exposure images in Lightroom. And then at the end, we'll have some more time for some Q&A, and then the workshop should hopefully conclude, if I run to time, at 9 o'clock. I'll try to be right on time there. So hopefully you are all familiar with how Zoom works, but I'll give you a quick rundown on how we're going to run the session. So if you can please keep your audio muted, that's just going to help if there's any background noise where you are, and it certainly helps the flow of the session better. And so if you can do that, that would be awesome. So we've had a couple more people join, so we may only be short 1 or 2 now. And if you would like to ask some questions along the way using the chat function, I'm just going to put a little, I've actually got a second screen running here, so I'm just going to say hi to everybody there. So you're welcome to put some, and that will should just pop up as a little notification in your kind of menu bar. So you're welcome to put any questions along the way in the chat function. If I see them out the corner of my eye, I may stop and answer them, but depending on how the flow of everything's going, I may just answer those when we come to the break in the middle, and then again at the end. And if you are asking a question, it'd be really awesome if you can make it really specific and obvious. For example, asking what lens should I use is a pretty general question, whereas asking what lens should I use when I'm capturing a lake scene in early morning light is quite targeted. And the more specific the questions are, obviously the better I'll be able to respond with the information to help. And especially if it's a question that's relating to a topic that's been sort of 15 or 20 minutes ago, then if it's a really targeted question, it'll be much easier for me to answer it well. So I'm also going to be providing a cheat sheet PDF of the key takeaways from the session. So I'll be giving that to George's camera afterwards. So you'll be able to get that on your email that will come out after the event. So first things first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about me, and so you can understand my background and sort of how I've come into landscape photography. So I've always loved travel and exploring, but it was only when I picked up my first DSLR camera and started taking photos of our family adventures when my kids were young, that I realized I was just happiest taking photos in the outdoors. And then, you know what, over time, I sort of realized how much more I enjoyed experiencing that sacred time, first thing in the morning, being out amongst God's creation and watching the sunrise and capturing that moment of first light. And I think there's a real expectation of hope that a new day brings. And my love of landscape photography really just grew from there. You might wonder why I chose landscape photography over another genre. Well, I think it's both the combination of being in the outdoors, which I love, and the fact that it's just so unexpected and you really don't know what you're going to get. I love the anticipation and the unique conditions that I get to experience, and I kind of love the thrill of the chase too. I mean, as much as it's frustrating when you go somewhere and you don't get the weather you want, it often just fuels me to come back and try again another time. Or if that's realistically not an option, then it's about how you can find it in yourself to be versatile enough to find something unique in the conditions that present themselves and turn that into something that's worthy of sharing. And some of the most recent milestones I've achieved is becoming one of only a handful of Sony New Zealand advocates. So that's enabled me to work really closely with the Sony team, both in New Zealand and Australia, to promote the brand through weekend landscape photography workshops and live events. And earlier this year, I was also asked to contribute to Sony's brand new campaign to promote their flagship A7R series of cameras and their top of the range G Master lenses, which is what I use in my everyday work. I was actually the only New Zealander and female photographer amongst a group of 6 who was chosen to be part of this campaign, so it was a real honour for me. And another brand that I'm really excited to be working with is Case Filters. So I'm actually an ambassador, global ambassador for them. I think neutral density filters, and hopefully you'll agree with me by the end of the session, are an essential part of any landscape photographer's kit. If you want to create beautifully exposed sunrise and sunset images, if you want to create lush waterfall scenes in the forest, or create cloud movement, then they are a must-have. So I'm actually the New Zealand distributor for Case Filters, and so that's what I'm going to be promoting through the workshop, because I really do believe in the brand. Over the years, I've used probably about 4 or 5 different brands of filters. So I kind of feel qualified to say that I do think they are the best in the market, but you'll be able to, I guess, hopefully see a little bit more about how they work, and I'll explain a bit more about that when we get into the filters in more detail. And when I'm not behind the lens, I am creating, when I'm not creating photography content or running workshops, I'm a wife and mum to 2 boys. I've got an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old. They're both mad keen on soccer. So most of the year I play taxi service between football training and games on the weekends, but I wouldn't have it any other way, and it makes a nice change from the photography too. So let's kick into it. So in terms of how we create art with long exposures, I sort of broken it down into what I think is a bit of a 3-step process. So for me, the first part of it is using the right equipment and settings. So that being the right lens, tripod, potentially a remote control, and the neutral density filters. I think the camera itself isn't quite as important, so long as you're using the right lens for the scene and the right combination of filters to enhance the scene, but I'll go into the gear side of things a bit more soon. The second step is composing the image to maximize the scene's potential. So that is deciding what you should be leaving in and leaving out. That can really make or break your image. And the third step is realizing the true image of your the true potential of your image through the process of editing. So I think mastering this 3-step process will help you to create beautiful images that you're proud of and that others are wowed by. So let's get into it. So first things first, what gear do you need for long exposure photography? It goes without saying, it's more than just a camera and a lens, because long exposures is using a slow shutter speed. So there's a few extra bits and pieces we need to help us achieve that. So camera and lenses, and then obviously a tripod, remote control timer, and the filters. So the camera. Now first things first, I want to say that the best camera is the one that you have. And yes, I do shoot with the newest and best full frame Sony camera available, but you don't need to have a full frame 61 megapixel camera to create amazing landscape long exposure images. An entry-level camera like a Sony a6000, a Nikon D3000, or a Canon crop sensor are perfectly good places to start. So you don't feel you have to have the top of the range camera to be able to create beautiful images, because it's actually the skill of the user which makes the images amazing. So I want to say that again. So it's actually the skill of the user which makes your images amazing, not the equipment. These are just the tools you use to help you along the way. I mean, ultimately, if you want to print really large scale images, like I'm talking A2 or above, you will need a camera with a decent sensor, but it's actually more important to get the basics right with your settings and composition. You can always upgrade your camera down the track, but if you haven't mastered how to create sharp images with good composition, having a bigger and better camera is not going to help. So the one setting that is beneficial to have on your camera is bulb mode. This obviously allows you to control how long the shutter is open for, and that can be up to several minutes with long exposures. Most cameras, cameras with interchangeable lenses will have bulb mode, but if you don't, you can still create long exposures of up to 30 seconds is generally the maximum that your cameras will set to before you have to go into bulb mode. But having bulb mode does, of course, give you much more flexibility. So the lenses that I shoot with, a 16 to 35, that's the one that's actually on the camera there. That's probably on my camera 80% of the time. It's a G Master lens and it's an f2.8 version, so it's really good in low light. I do love big, wide, open landscape shots, and that wide angle gives me the ability to incorporate a huge amount into my scenes. And then I shoot with a 24-70, which is a mid-range, everyday use lens. I've actually found myself growing to love this lens way more this year. I had a recent trip to the South Island and it was actually on my camera more than my wide angle. For me, it was a bit of a deliberate attempt to force myself to think about some different compositions rather than relying on my default, which tends to be going with my wide angle lens. The last lens which makes up my kit is a 70 to 300 telephoto zoom. And again, on this last trip down south, I really forced myself to use some long zoom shots, and I was really happy with the results. And I think using my tripod more helped with that to get some a lot sharper images as well. So in terms of the one I use most for long exposure, it is almost always the wide angle. And firstly, as I said, it's better shooting in low light because the aperture does go down to 2.8. But also, if you're trying to fit in as much of the sky as well as your foreground as possible, a wide angle is really great for that. So I actually don't find that I use my filters that much on my telephoto zoom because often that's a real kind of a detail focus, a mountain peak, or something that sort of where you're really compressing the scene to get closer to you. And also a telephoto lens, you're usually having to shoot pretty fast to get sharp images. It's often not that easy to sort of shoot really long with a long zoom like that. So a tripod, a good tripod can make all the difference in your long exposure photography. Having the right tripod for you should be the next consideration after your camera and lenses. This is because you can't possibly shoot sharp long exposures without the camera being perfectly still. So a really stable and well-designed tripod is key. I've only recently upgraded from a more compact sort of Manfrotto travel tripod to this bigger tripod here. And I was really averse to getting a bulkier tripod for such a long time because I'm always trying to keep the weight of my total kit down. And I was thinking it was just going to be another heavier thing to carry on a hike, but I really wish I'd done it much sooner. I've actually just got my tripod that I've got here. So this is the Sarui N2204 tripod, and I use it with the K20X ball head. I've kind of tell you why I love it so much as I go through the different bits of sort of components. But even though it's a bigger tripod, because I've gone carbon fiber, it is more expensive, but it's reduces vibrations and it's much more. It's actually a lot lighter weight as well. That material. Sorry, I've just lost my place there. Stability and portability. So weight and stability, you would think go hand in hand, but you'd think, well, if it's heavy, then it's not going to be very portable. But because I'm actually carrying a tripod that's a few hundred grams heavier than my last one, but it's got a much nicer design, so it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. And a tripod that is well designed will often have one of these center columns, which you can kind of, it's probably a bit hard to see there, but a center column like this where you can actually hang a bag or something off of it, because you're going to want to be really stable in windy conditions and when you want that camera to be perfectly still for a long period of time. A ball head, I highly recommend a ball head over the pan and tilt style heads. Whenever I've seen participants using the other type of heads on a workshop, they always seem to be faffing for an infinite amount of time to try and get their angles and adjustments right, whereas a ball head just allows for really quick adjustments as the whole ball swivels in its socket. Some tripods will come with a ball head integrated into the tripod, but others are separate. What is good about that is that if you want to choose extra features, you can. This particular one that I've got has got a little, you can actually swivel it right to left as well. So if you're trying to do panoramas, it's quite useful for that as well. But my best investment though, recently was getting an L bracket on my actual camera. So what an L bracket does is it actually sits here to the side of your camera, so that when your camera's on the tripod, if you want to switch and go vertical, you just take the whole thing off and put it on that way. And what that means is that instead of having your camera attached to the tripod and turning it on its side and having just this minute amount of movement as the weight of your camera is trying to kind of stay still with just that tiny little screw in your tripod attachment, when you've got it set fully on top like that, there's no movement whatsoever. So it makes vertical long exposures a lot better when you're not having to worry about the fact that the screw in your tripod might be minutely moving and causing shake. So I'm using the Sunway Photo L bracket that's specifically made for that camera. So yeah, definitely worth investing in a solid and sturdy tripod. And those are the ones that I was just talking about there. So the other thing, for scenes of up to 30 seconds, you can just use your inbuilt camera timer delay to give the camera time to settle. I would always, if I'm starting to shoot slower, and I'm talking kind of like 1/10 of a second or less, put my camera onto 2-second timer, so that when I've pushed the shutter and let go, the camera's actually got 2 seconds to kind of settle, so there's no movement from me having touched the shutter to enable it to be perfectly still. You've obviously got 2, 5 and 10-second options generally as default in your camera, but 2 seconds is usually enough. And if the light's changing really quickly, you probably don't want to be having to wait 10 seconds before every shot that you're taking. Where a remote timer comes into its own is for exposures longer than 30 seconds when you're in what's known as bulb mode. And this is when you can use your remote control to give you full control over how long you leave your shutter open for. You can have it open for 1 minute, 2, 4 minutes, basically however long you like. And to get sharp images at that slower shutter speed, you really do want to make sure that when you're pushing the shutter, you're not getting that camera shake, like I said before. The other thing a remote control timer is really handy for is if you like doing time lapses or star trails, because you can buy ones that allow you to shoot at set intervals. They're not terribly expensive. I think mine was only about $50 and the battery seemed to last a pretty good length of time too. Don't do what I did with my first remote timer though. I was shooting some astrophotography on a jetty in the Coromandel in New Zealand here, and I had my wireless timer in my pocket, and I went to grab it out of my very slippery puffer jacket pocket, and I just flung it off the jetty and into the salt water. Even though the water was reasonably shallow, I did not bother going to retrieve it because salt water, electronics and batteries are not a particularly good combination. So there was a bit of money down the drain. So don't be as clumsy as me. So I use this wireless remote timer here, known as the Pixel T9, and it's got an intervalometer function, like I said before. I like the fact that it's wireless too, so I don't have to be standing right next to my camera with the cable attached. I can be wandering around within a reasonable amount of distance and still press the button, but it's not a necessity to have a wireless one. So filters. Neutral density filters are the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to equipment for long exposure work. And when I first started out, I used a brand called Lee filters. Lee filters were probably the premier brand of filters back in the day. And there probably weren't that many other filter companies to choose from. There's been a lot more come on the market since. One of the reasons why I switched from them was I really wasn't a fan of the big blue color cast that their filters created in my images. And you'll see when we go through the workshop, I do tend to edit with a lot of warm colors, and it was quite hard to make most of those beautiful sunrise and sunset goldeny pinky hues when you're starting off with a very blue, sort of almost white balance in your photo from the filters creating that. Also, their filters, their graduated filters, were made of perspex and not glass. So they scratch pretty easily and weren't very easy to clean, and they also weren't very good at creating sharp images. Now, I know when you're starting out, it can be really tempting just to go and buy some cheap screw-in filters. But like a lot of things in life, you really do get what you pay for in terms of quality. I think about it like this. You can buy a $2 pair of reading glasses from the pharmacy, and then I'm sure that will help you read the images on the page that are a little bit blurry if you're a bit long-sighted. However, if you go to the optometrist and you get glasses that are designed especially for your eyes, particularly if you're like me and you've got two eyes that have got quite different vision, not only will you be able to see much more clearly, but then you can also get special UV filters on the glass. You can actually see the UV filters on my glasses here. You can see how they're kind of blue to reduce glare off of screens. So my analogy to filters is this: if you pay for high quality optical glass that is scratch resistant and easy to clean, you're going to come away with much sharper images with true to life color. And that is the ultimate goal, because we want to use filters to enhance our images and not to detract from them. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a Case Filters ambassador, and I'm also the New Zealand distributor for Case. So that's what I'm going to promote through the workshop, because I believe in the brand. And look, it's actually not just me saying that. I do get a lot of feedback from customers that the lightweight design of their holders and the magnetic polarizer is a game changer for them. I've used about 4 different brands of filters, and whilst a couple of the other brands do have quite good quality glass, the design of their holder systems is pretty bulky and not very well designed. So I do feel qualified to say that Case are really the best out there. Now, there are 2 types of sort of filter sets that you can get. Now, one of these is a magnetic round set. So this is where Case has been quite revolutionary. I think they were pretty much the first to introduce these magnetic sets. So basically, you use I'm going to explain about what all the different filters do, probably in the next, it starts on the next slide, but just to kind of give you an overview. You can use what's known as a polarizer, and then you can stack 1 or 2 filters in front of it. The pros of using a little magnetic set is they're very quick and easy to attach to the camera. That's literally it. And you screw in the first, you basically screw in the first thing, and then the other 2 just literally clip in together like that as a magnet. So they are very quick and easy to use. The only thing is, if you are using say you're using an 82mm lens thread and you buy the 82mm filters, you possibly will get a little bit of vignetting around the outside, so black around the outside of your image. I always recommend people to size up. So if you had a 82mm thread, you might be better off buying the 95, just so that there's an overlap there to the sides. The only other downside of using a set like this is that you can't really use a graduated filter, which I'm going to explain what that does in a minute. Graduated filters basically darken half of your shot so that you can make your exposures more even. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of a downside of using a round set. The square filter holder system is generally what most photographers kind of start out with. The pros are that this has been designed to not have any vignetting on it at all. So the holder just, you just basically screw that front bit onto your lens, and then you can see here how the polarizer works. Hopefully you can kind of see that changing. Maybe if I do the other way around, gosh, it looks very purple all of a sudden. You can kind of see it moving and changing there. And I'll be explaining what the polarizer does. And then basically you've got 2 little slots here, and you just slot in a graduated filter and a darker filter there. So you end up with 3 stacked filters depending on what type of work you're doing. And yeah, the beauty is that because you can use a graduated filter with them, you can adjust that as needed. So this is my graduated filter here. You can see here it's got a graduation between the darkest part and the lightest part of the image, and you just basically slot that in there. And then depending on where your horizon is in your image, you can just move it up and down, darken it or lighten it. You can obviously slant it if you've got, you know, if you're on an angle, you might be up against a cave or something like that. So yeah, really, really easy to manipulate that to how you want it. And obviously the downside of the square filter system is it's slightly more expensive generally than just buying that one kit, sorry, the one magnetic set. But because you can use it with different lens sizes, it comes, the kits come with 4 different lens thread sizes, so you can just switch it out between your different lenses really easily. So what do all these filters do? So a graduated filter, as I said before, balances the exposure between the sky and the foreground. This is by far my most used filter. I am a huge fan of shooting in around golden hour during sunrise and sunset, and a graduated filter is a must-have at that time of the day. That's because at that time of the day, the sky is really bright because the sun's getting lower and it's kind of either sort of generally angling towards you if you've got the sun in your shot, which means your foreground is often quite dark. What it does is obviously even that out. So instead of having a really bright sky and a dark foreground, you've suddenly got more dynamic, or you've reduced your total dynamic range that you need to shoot. So it makes it much easier to obtain a balanced exposure in your camera before you even have to apply any form of editing to it. There are various varying strengths of graduated filters. The 3-stop is probably the most common, and that's because it seems to be about the right amount of dark to light required during those sort of times around sort of golden hour, sunrise and sunset, when, you know, in terms of how much difference there is between the light and dark in your scene. You can actually get soft, hard or reverse. This is what a hard grad looks like. I don't actually own one of these. I know people who swear by them, but to me, the only time they're really useful is if you're doing seascapes and you've got a very defined horizon line, because otherwise, if you've got like a tree or a mountain in the middle of your area here, then it becomes quite an obvious horizon line. Oops, gone the wrong way. And then a reverse grad, well, that basically to me is only really useful at about the point where the sun is hitting the horizon, because that's when the sun will be in this part of your shot, but your sky is starting to get darker, and so that sort of lightens up the top. But for me, I think the soft grads are definitely the most useful. And so here's an example of shooting with and without. So you can see in the shot on the left here that the sky is pretty blown out, but as soon as you've put that graduated filter on, then you've just evened out that whole exposure, and it just allows you to kind of have a better starting point for when you're coming to do any editing. I've had people say to me, you know, why wouldn't I just exposure bracket instead of using a graduated filter? And by exposure bracketing, I mean taking 2 or more exposures. So you might expose correctly for the sky in one shot. You'd have to have your camera on a tripod anyway doing this, but you'd expose for the sky in one shot, and you'd expose for the ground in the other shot, and then you combine them in post-processing. Now that is totally an option, and I know that there's plenty of people out there who do that and don't use graduated filters, but this adds multiple images into your image library, and if you're like me shooting with 61 megapixel files, I'm pretty keen to avoid clogging up my image library with multiple image files for every single shot. For me, a graduated filter gives me a much better option to get a balanced exposure in camera and reduce the amount of processing I have to do later, and reducing that histogram range between your shadows and your highlights. I've also had other people say, well, why wouldn't you just use the graduated filter option in Lightroom? But I find that even with using a graduated filter on my camera in the field, I'm usually still adding graduated filters down the track too. You'll see that more when we come to the image editing later on in the session. But for now, I guess you just need to know the biggest benefit is that it's greatly reducing the entire dynamic range of the scene, which allows you much more room to play with your highlights and shadows in post-processing. So neutral density filters, well, what are these? These basically act like a pair of dark sunglasses over your camera shutter to increase the length of your exposures. They're particularly useful to create beautiful scenes with flowing water or cloud movement. They come in different strengths, the most popular being the 6-stop, otherwise known Sorry, I've just noticed a couple of questions. I did say I probably wouldn't be onto it. Yes, a recording of the session is going to be sent out afterwards. I just have to send that over with the cheat sheet. If using multiple filters, the polarizing filter goes closest to the lens. You can actually, with the holders, you can actually use the polarizer without having to use the holder at all, because it is magnetic. And that's the other thing I didn't actually mention about this particular, and that's why again, case with their magnetic design, a lot of the filter holders, the polarizer is fully integrated into the holder, so you almost have to pull the whole holder apart, take the polarizer out if you want to shoot without it, because there are some times where I actually do take mine out and don't use it. But the beauty of this one is that it's just got a little magnetic catch there, so it's pretty easy to drop in and drop out. But yeah, this is always closest to your lens. It doesn't really matter whether you put a graduated or a neutral density filter on, in which order. I have, not so much certainly shooting mirrorless, but when I used to shoot with a DSLR, I did sometimes find that I needed to put the dark one that I'm talking about here closest to my holder to prevent any light leak into the sensor. But with a mirrorless, it doesn't matter, because you're obviously not, the sensor works differently. So yes, the different strengths of the filters. So the 6 stop is otherwise known as a little stopper or an ND64, and this is really useful around waterfalls or in low light situations around sunrise and sunset, where you want to extend your exposure, but there's actually not that much light around anyway. The 10 stop comes into its own on much brighter days, or if you want to do very, very long exposures of sort of a few minutes or more, particularly if you're trying to accentuate cloud movement. So here's an example of a shot with and without an ND filter, one shot at 1/30th of a second and the other one at 30 seconds. You can see how different the clouds and the water look. So the water has obviously been all smoothed out by that extra length of time, and same with the clouds. I mean, it's slightly different times. Those are probably taken about 20 minutes apart, but the clouds look completely different in this scene to the next. And yeah, depending on the direction the clouds are moving to, you can often get an awesome sense of the clouds sort of rushing towards you with long exposures, depending on which way the wind's going. So the last piece of the puzzle is the circular polarizer, and this is like I was saying, where I think the case model is streets ahead of any others, because it's integrated but magnetic, so it's easy to remove. And you can actually, as I said, you can actually attach, just take this bit out here, you can actually just attach this whole bit here to your camera without having to use your holder at all, which is kind of cool. Makes it a little bit less bulky a setup. So what is a CPL or circular polarizer? What is it good for? Reducing reflections around water. You can see in this example here the difference between the polarizer being not sort of, I guess, turned on, if you like, in the shot on the left, and in the shot on the right, you can almost, it's reduced the reflections to the point where you can pretty much see through the water down to the rocks below. Another place that it is invaluable is in a forest. I am a huge fan of shooting waterfalls and rivers, and I would never shoot without a polarizer in the forest. The effect is twofold. So not only does it reduce the reflections on the water itself, you can kind of see the water looks a lot darker, it's got less light reflecting off it, but look how much greener the forest is as well, because light bounces off the leaves and everything in the forest, and by reducing those reflections, you basically come away with this much lusher, greener looking scene before you've even done any editing at all. The other thing that it's really good for is to enhance the blue colours of the sky. This shot is actually in the Nevis Valley, which is out the back of Queenstown, and you can only access it by 4-wheel drive. This was taken on a really bright blue sky day in autumn, and so using a polarizer really enhanced the blues and golds tones in this image. My one warning that comes with using a CPL is you want to avoid this happening. So that's where, depending on where you are standing in relation to the sun, you can sometimes get this awful banding going on if you're shooting with a very blue sky. So you just have to rotate the the polarizer a little bit to kind of avoid that happening. It's just a bit of a trick for young players, and it's not something you can easily fix in post-processing when you've got very different shades of blue going on in your sky. So the most cost-effective way to purchase kits is purchase filters is in a kit. You can get different kits depending on the size of your biggest lens. So the K9 kit is designed for full frame and mirrorless cameras, and that's sort of designed for lenses from 67 through to 82 mils. And if you've got a little crop sensor or a sort of a 4/3, Olympus, Fuji, that kind of thing that's got a smaller lenses, you can get a kit that's designed for those. They're quite cute actually. I almost wish that my camera would fit them because they're a bit smaller to carry around, these ones. So the kits come with a holder, the polarizer, graduated filter, neutral density filter, the 6-stop, and then a few geared adapter rings so that you can use it on your different size of lenses. I'm actually going to be running a special offer for anybody who's attended the workshop, and 10% off the New Zealand retail price, and the link will be in the email. If you haven't already got that prior to this, the link will be in the email that goes out from George's afterwards. I'm also very happy to answer any questions you might have about filters that would be right for your camera, your lenses, and your type of photography. So you're very welcome to email me after the event. I'll make sure my email's in the info that gets sent out. And then, of course, the magnetic kits, I'll be offering 10% off of those. I can't give a definitive price because the price is all different depending on what size of the magnetic that you go for and whether you go for an entry level or a professional one. I've also written a couple of reviews with videos on how to use the filter, so I'll include those in the information afterwards as well. I don't know where everybody is based around the world. If you're based in Australia, I think shipping is about $35. If you're based in New Zealand, obviously it's nice and easy because I am too, and if you're based elsewhere around the world, then please just get in touch because I can let you know potentially the best way to purchase, and it may be that you want to hook up with a local case distributor where you are. Okay, let's go on to some settings then. So the camera settings for long exposure landscapes. At its most basic, hopefully you're all pretty familiar with the exposure triangle, but a correctly exposed image is made up of 3 parts, and each has a very important part to play. The first of these is shutter speed. So this is how long the shutter is open for to let light in during your exposure. And to create motion blur at waterfalls on the beach, you need to slow the shutter speed down so the shutter is open for sort of a second or more or longer, minutes even. And as I said before, the slower speed a camera can generally take shots at is 30 seconds before you have to put it into bulb mode where you control how long the shutter is open for. And this is an example here of a long exposure that was not quite 2 minutes, no, 2 minutes and a half. My brain's gone to sleep, it's too late at night here. So that's an example of where that shutter was open for a whole 145 seconds. Now, aperture, of course, is the second part, and that is how big is the hole that's going to let the light in. So the aperture is how big the pinhole is in the front of your lens letting the light in. Obviously, f1.8 down this end is a very wide hole, and that's letting lots and lots of light in, and that's where you get that very shallow depth of field, which is beautiful for that it means only a very small portion of your image is in focus, and it's great for portraits if you want a really lovely blued background. Whereas f16 to f22 is where the hole is at its smallest. It's not letting a lot of light in. Now, every zoom lens has a slightly different sweet spot where the apertures will be sharpest, and this is not usually at either end. So it's usually somewhere in the middle. And I always say for landscapes that, and well, not just I always say, that's pretty much a rule of thumb, that f8 to f11 is the best aperture to shoot at to get really sharp depth of field in your images. You might say, well, why wouldn't I just shoot at f22? Because that's the narrowest, but I don't know how easy it will be to see on the screen here, but there's quite a distinct difference in sharpness between the shot at f11 and the shot at f22. The closer you get down towards that narrow end of the aperture, you're starting to get what's known as diffraction, and it actually reduces the sharpness of your images. Now, there's times when shooting down that narrow end is, you might deliberately do it if you're trying to create a really nice sun star or something in your images. And that's perfectly okay, but to sort of a go-to setting, I'm always trying to keep my my aperture if I can between f8 and f11, depending on what scene depending on where I'm at. Sometimes I have to go either side of that, but for the most part, when I've got multiple opportunities, I'll try and keep it there. Now, the third aspect is the ISO. So the ISO is how sensitive the camera is to the light. Landscape photographers will always try and shoot with the lowest ISO possible, because a photo taken at too high an ISO will show a lot of grain, also known as noise, and then it may not be usable for printing at any decent size. So brightening a photo via ISO when the light is low is always a bit of a trade-off. I think that you should, well, ideally you should only raise your ISO when you can't change your shutter speed or aperture. For example, if you, like long exposures aside, if you're going to be using a longer shutter speed and that's going to cause your subject to be blurry, then you might not have a choice but to increase your ISO. A good example is my son plays indoor futsal, and I was taking some shots there earlier in the year, and I had to have a fast shutter speed because I wanted to freeze their action. Had my aperture as wide open as it would go, down to like f1.8 or f2.8, but it was still pretty dim in there because it's indoor lighting. So I had to increase my ISO up to about 800 or 1600, which yes, did make the images pretty noisy, but because they're only ever going to be emailed and shared on Facebook, I didn't think it was too much of a bad thing. But here's some examples of ISO in action. So this is a shot zoomed into 100% at ISO 100. If you take note in particular, looking at the grain that's visible in the sky here. So this is pretty much the same shot taken a little bit later in the evening, and I'd had to increase my ISO up to 400, and you can see just in the grain, you can just kind of see how it looked, getting a little bit more pixelated there in that sky. So what if you want to, sorry, go to settings, I'm getting ahead of myself here. When I start shooting a scene, therefore, I'm aiming for ISO 100, aperture f8 to f11, and then shutter speed. That's what becomes your changing variable. And that's okay to play with until it's not. And by that I mean, in this example here, I'm shooting at 1/80th of a second, which is kind of quick. I wouldn't have, probably wouldn't have even needed a tripod at that speed. But I actually would like to introduce some lovely sort of silky water here and see if there's any cloud movement happening. But that was already quite a well exposed image. So the only option I have available to me is to then put those neutral density filters, bring those into the equation. And that's that pair of dark sunglasses. Oh, I've got a moth flying around. Let's hope he doesn't annoy me too much. Sort of a pair of dark sunglasses, which enables your shutter speed to be open for much longer. So that's basically what allowed me to go from 1/80th of a second down to 10 seconds by putting on an ND filter. And you can just see how much more the water is smoothed out. There's a little bit of silkiness going on in the waves there. Tiny bit of cloud movement. The clouds weren't moving that much, and 10 seconds probably isn't really long enough to capture that anyway. Some cameras will also allow you to lower your ISO further to below 100. I think mine goes down to ISO 50, so that's an option if the day's particularly bright, but you can get better results just by adding an ND filter to slow your shutter down. I might have to try and kill that moth when we have our halftime break. It's just flying around in my field of view. So I do hope that most of you are already shooting in RAW, but I did just want to quickly go over the reasons why you would want to be doing this. So I have had people say to me, why would I shoot in RAW? Because the files take up more space and they look so bland and yuck. And both of those comments are true, but there's perfectly good reason for that. So let's dig into it. So when you shoot a JPEG rather than a RAW, your camera is acting like a built-in editor. It's giving you its best guess of how it thinks that image should be edited. It's applying highlights, shadows, contrast, and sharpening before saving that file as a compressed version of itself. So once the camera's done that, you're effectively looking at a finished version of the file. So it's very difficult to make major adjustments to it because all that data has already been hard-coded and embedded in the file. A RAW file, on the other hand, gives you a real blank canvas to start with. You get 16,000 levels of brightness to use in your editing versus only 256 in a JPEG. So those additional massive steps of brightness let you make infinitely more adjustments to your exposure, your blacks, your lights, your contrast, and your brightness. and without any reduction in quality. The other thing that shooting in RAW does, if you're shooting in JPEG, the camera's also basically making a decision on what it thinks your white balance should be, and it doesn't give you much room to make adjustments to your colors without it starting to look, quite fake and over-processed. Whereas a RAW file, yes, it will start with the white balance you shot at, but you've got full control to make some changes to temperature and tone while you edit. And also, because you're starting from scratch with the RAW file, you can reset your adjustments at any time and start afresh. It's like, drawing with a pencil and rubbing it out, versus when you edit a JPEG, you're editing on top of those adjustments the camera's already made, and it's kind of like drawing with a colored marker on top of an already finished picture. When you export a RAW file, you've also got more choice too. You can export as a full-size JPEG or even as a TIFF file, which is really good for large-scale printing. And it retains so much more of the data, so that when you zoom in, you can just see how much more detail is in the image. I don't know how easy it is to tell from these shots, but hopefully you can tell the shot on the right, which started as a RAW file, is right side by side to the JPEG, which is a much smaller and compressed version of itself. Now, one tool that I use a lot in my work, and I think it's really invaluable for getting your correct exposure, is histogram. Hopefully you have come across it before. Histogram is made up of blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. And it's, if you're already editing in Lightroom, you'll have seen it in the top right-hand side of your screen when you're doing your edits. Also, you can turn it on in camera, and I highly recommend, if you can, have it turned on in your viewfinder or your live view whilst you're shooting. It just gives you instant feedback about where you're at in terms of your exposures. Now, a perfect histogram can sometimes look a little bit like a bell curve graph, but not always. It depends a lot on the tones that are in each individual image. An image with a histogram far over to the left, let's say that all this grey part was over here, that would be underexposed. And to the opposite here, this is a histogram of a fairly overexposed image where you've got a lot of stuff hard up against the white end of the spectrum. But let's take a look at an actual histogram with a high dynamic range. So while the goal should be to keep your exposure within the bounds of that histogram at all times, sometimes it's actually not that easy if you're shooting a scene that's got a very high dynamic range, like this one, for example. So you can see here, I've exposed for the highlights. I've made sure that the sky's not blown out, but what it has done is create very dark patches of my image, to the point where, if you're familiar with Lightroom, you'll know that this these little buttons here show what's known as shadow clipping and highlight clipping. So shadow clipping is where there's a completely black part of your image, and it shows up as blue. And on the flip side, if you've got something that's totally overexposed, it'll show up as red if you turn on your highlight clipping. Now, you'd probably look at that shot and say, wow, that's going to be pretty hard to edit. There's a huge dynamic range there in that shot. But because I exposed and made sure that I didn't have anything that was too blown out on the light side of things, after processing, it's actually quite amazing how much data can be brought back from the shadows. You can always, yes, you might introduce a tiny bit of noise into your image when you're bringing up darks into light, but if you have overexposed parts of your image that are completely white, you actually can't bring any detail back to them when you try and reduce your highlights. You just end up with completely grey patches in your image. So if in doubt, expose for the highlights and process for the shadows. Now, the only time when figuring out your exposure with a histogram is tricky is if you're using that bulb mode that I was talking about before, because you don't know how long you're going to need to have your exposure for, because you can't really tell but before you're sort of hitting go on your exposures. And that's where you have to rely on an app, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to get your correct exposure once you've put your dark filter on the front. But how do you guarantee both sharp focus and correct exposure when shooting a long exposure image? Well, first of all, tripod goes without saying. Now, on the whole, just as a slight aside, hopefully you're semi-familiar with the 1/4 the focal length rule for shooting tripod versus handheld. the basic rule of thumb is whatever your focal length is, so if I'm shooting with my wide angle lens at 16 millimeters wide, I should be able to shoot as slow as 1/16 of a second handheld and it be okay. If I was shooting with my telephoto and I was shooting at 200 mils, I'd have to probably shoot on a tripod if I was any slower than 1/200, which is actually quite fast. And that's why I think in the past I've been guilty of having quite blurry telephoto shots, because I don't think I was really kind of taking note of that sort of rule. Now, obviously, if you've got image stabilization in your cameras, often you can shoot slower than the sort of rule, but for the most part, I tend to always err on the side of caution when it comes to using a tripod. Now, just talking about image stabilization, every camera and lens is different. Yours may call it vibration reduction. The Sony's call it steady shot. Some cameras have it inbuilt, but also a lot of lenses do too. When image stabilization is basically, like I said, it's a way to shoot slower handheld and to get sharp images of static subjects when you're shooting at that sort of slower speed. So if you're using a tripod in very stable conditions, it's actually not a good idea to have, excuse me, I'm going to have a drink. It's actually not a good idea to have your image stabilization on, because the way it works is that it looks for vibrations in your camera in order to reduce it. But if it doesn't find any, like when you're solid and stable on a tripod, it can actually cause vibrations. And as a result, might cause some camera shake and introduce a tiny amount of blurriness into your shot. So I always tend to work on the proviso of, if I'm shooting handheld, I have it turned on, and if I'm on a tripod and it's solid and sturdy, I'll turn it off. You do need to make sure though that you're aware of your settings, because if you've got it both in camera and on your lens, you have to turn it off in both places. Now, using autofocus is generally fine for long exposures, but you might find you need to switch to manual, because it could end up being too dark for the camera to focus, because once you've got this up against your lens, your camera might go, I can't actually see what I'm trying to focus on, and it might just keep searching the whole time, it does that whole zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out as it's trying to focus. So my recommendation is, if that's happening to you when you're trying to do long exposures, is to focus without your filter on first, and then switch it to manual. You can most lenses have a autofocus manual switch, otherwise you can generally do it in camera as well. And then you put your dark filter on the front, and then it won't try and refocus your scene. You can just happily push the shutter. And the other key, of course, is to use your timer and remote control for any of your slower shutter speed as well. So how do you achieve a correct exposure once you're in that bulb mode? So the easiest way is to use an app that helps you convert the time based on what strength of filter you're using. So in this example here, this is actually Lee Filter's app. So it's got both settings for a 6-stop and a 10-stop. So you just have to switch between the tabs. This is a free app on the App Store. Shouldn't probably be promoting Lee, but there you go. It's a pretty good app and I find it really useful. So if I was shooting a perfectly exposed image at 1/15 of a second, I can look at this here and know that once I put that 6-stop in front, all I need to do is change my exposure down to 4 seconds, and it will be correct for that filter. If I was to click over into the 10-stop, it will actually change that shutter speed and increase it to 1 minute. So from 4 seconds with a 6-stop to 1 minute with a 10-stop, you can see it's quite a big difference between the two strengths of those filters. So, oh, goodness me, I'm almost bang on time there. I was thinking I might have run over too short or too soon, but we've pretty much come to the end of the equipment and setting side of things. So if anybody has any other questions they want to chuck in the chat, feel free. Otherwise, you're welcome to take a couple-minute break, grab a cup of tea. I'm going to have some water and finish my cold cup of tea. And we will carry on with the second half, talking about composition and editing. Bang on, well, we probably don't need to wait till, yeah, we'll give it 3 or 4 minutes. So if there's no questions, then we'll start back again at like 2 minutes to 9-ish. And yeah, thank you all for your participation so far. And I'm going to quickly run away and 2 minutes, finish drinking my cold cup of tea, and I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, I'll just give it one more minute because I can see that there's a couple of people who are still not back in their seats, and I think one of them asked a question, so I'll be keen for her to hear what I was going to say. And just, oops. Okay, we'll give it one more minute. Hopefully Nick is, can't tell if Nick's there or not because he's only got his sound, but Nick was, yep, you're there, cool. Nick was saying it's sometimes very hard to see your image, and I don't know if I had started to answer that, but yes, I would definitely compose with the filters off first, and then I'm just gonna recap how you calculate your exposure. Well, as I said, I use this app which is super handy. So say for example, I'll do a live version here so it's a bit easier to see. So I don't think you can see that very well, but let's say for example you were composing without your filters and you had it set, your camera was set to 1/30th of a second. Then you've composed your shot, you've done your focus, you might have then gone, I'm going to put it onto manual focus so it doesn't try and refocus through the filter. Then I'll put my filter on the front, and then I'll change my exposure down to 2 seconds, because that will be, or say change it down, increase, I guess you're increasing it because you're making it longer, but I'll increase my shutter speed to 2 seconds, and that will compensate for that darkness. Now, say I was using my 10 stop, for that exact same setting, I would need to extend my shutter to 30 seconds because the 10 stop is a lot darker than the 6 stop. So it's a bit more of a process than just turning up with your camera and shooting without filters. There's a little bit more sort of involved, but I guess once you get the hang of, you set yourself up as if you're not shooting a long exposure, and then you go, right, okay, I want to put my filter on the front, I'm going to compose my scene, put it into manual if I need to. Like I don't always use manual focus. Sometimes often for exposures up to sort of 20 or 30 seconds, if there's a reasonable amount of light around, I actually find my camera is actually quite capable of still auto-focusing with the 6 stop filter on, not so much with the 10 stop because it's so dark. So that's where you would have to compose first, switch to manual focus, put your filter on the front, and then figure out your exposure time with your app. Now, I think generally most kits, I've often when I've bought kits from different suppliers, they usually come with a little handy pocket guide, but I can never find those at the end of the day, and I've always got my phone on me, which is why I prefer using the app there to help me calculate how long I need to shoot for. No, the one thing about the case filters is they're pretty much, well, they've got 0 color cast. I think, as I said, I've used for 4 brands of filters now, and I do like the fact I can pull out all my nice natural colors that I've seen in camera without having any kind of color cast there. So yeah, certainly nothing like the blues that I was finding with the Lee filters there. So I think different. I know that I've got a few friends who shoot with Nissi filters, and I think they might have a slightly magenta color cast. I'm sure Case probably does have a tiny cast of some description, but I've never noticed it being any particular hue, whereas I think, as I said with Lee, it was horrendously blue all the time. I used to do my head in because I couldn't bring out my nice warm colors from sunset and sunrise. Yeah, the Lee from the blue, and that was my main reason for moving away from it, Dot, was because I was having exactly the same issue. Now, Louise asked a question. Hopefully Louise is back. I'll just flick up to the top. Louise is back now, cool. Nikon Coolpix. I had a lady, I've been running an online photography course earlier this year, and I had a lady who was using a Coolpix 900, and they're what I would call a sort of a bridge between a point and shoot and a DSLR, and they're definitely quite capable. And I think they've got, I was just looking at the specs in the break. They've got a pretty amazing zoom on them, but I don't know that I'm not sure that they're interchangeable as such. It looks like it's sort of a fixed, it's just an all-in-one in terms of not being able to change lenses depending on what you're doing. I don't know if you could use filters on the front of them or not. I have a feeling that you have to have a look to see whether it's got, because to be able to use filters, you have to have a screw, like a thread on the front to screw them onto. Certainly as a sort of a starting point, if you have never used if you're sort of going from a point and shoot to, wanting something that's a sort of an in-between, it's probably be a good starting point, but you probably get more benefit out of a sort of a cheaper crop sensor with sort of multiple lens options as well. So that's just something to think about flexibility wise as well. So hang on, I can see the messages are coming in. I think from what I know of Nissi, I've got a friend who shoots with them, and she always says they have a slightly pinky colour cast, which is not a bad thing if you're sort of tend to shooting around that sunset and sunrise time. I think sort of a magenta pinky cast. But like I said, I've never really noticed anything in particular with case. I certainly always feel I can pull out the colours that I want to from the scene. So we've been past there. If there's nothing else, we'll kick into our composition. Now I've just turn my notes back on because I went out of them. So composition in any form of, not just for long exposures, but our goal with composition is that we want to be creating images that invoke an emotion, both in ourselves and in others. So we want our images to make us feel something or others feel something. That might be a feeling of wonder at the beauty of nature and the conditions that presented themselves on that occasion. It might be maybe surprise at the uniqueness of the setting. It could be a feeling of being really connected to that exact moment or that location, which is very special to you. It might be a feeling of how small we are as humanity in this big wide universe. There's many different ways for us to feel about an image, but ultimately that's what we're aiming for. Not just for someone to look at a shot and move on, but to actually stop and be quite sort of, brought into our image and to really feel something about what we've captured. So why do a long exposure at all? Why create long exposures? To me, I believe that it's because they look more like art and less like real life. You wouldn't turn up to this lake here and see that scene exactly like that, because that's 42 seconds of shutter, the shutter being open for which has created the movement in the clouds and smoothed out that water. I think they're one of the most artistic techniques you can add to your landscape photography arsenal, and that's by combining the different tools you have at hand, your graduated filter, your circular polarizer, and your neutral density. Now, long exposures will generally require a 6 or 10 stop neutral density filter, but of course they can be combined with the other two to enhance the overall effect. And what is a long exposure? Well, like I said, I think it's anything that adds this element of smooth or silky flow into a scene, whether that's in the clouds or the water or both. And that's not how our eyes would naturally see it if we were standing there. And it could be as little as just 1 second, or it could be as long as 5 minutes long. Now, generally to get any cloud movement, you need to have some wind up in the atmosphere. But on the flip side, that can wreak havoc with your foreground if you are trying to maintain reflections in still water. So the way that you can get it working well is if you've got higher wind that's up in the atmosphere, but not so much down at the ground level. Or you can find a really sheltered spot to shoot from. So that's exactly what happened in this shot. This is shot in Twizel in the Mackenzie country in New Zealand. It was actually a pretty breezy morning, and this is the second spot I'd come to. The first spot I went to, I didn't love the conditions, and so I hightailed it 10 minutes down the road. I was aiming for here because I'd shot here before, and when I got here, and also knew the direction the wind was coming from, and when I got here I knew that where I was right down by the water here, but behind me there was a big hill which was protecting me mostly from the wind, and you can kind of see that in the shot because over here it wasn't a particularly big hill, it only kind of covered half the lake, and so you can see here where the water's a lot less reflecting, as where the wind was obviously whipping around the side of the hill and hitting the water there. You can also get really lovely water movement and flowing water, and that's whether it's a river, a waterfall, or waves. And I've got lots of examples of that coming up soon. I'm also going to give you a few ideas around composition techniques, which will make your images look really balanced and keep people's attention. There is no doubt about it though, there are challenges to achieving success with long exposures. That's both in getting the exposure correct and the image sharp, but also missing the moment. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about hot pixels as well. It sounds intriguing, it's not as exciting as it sounds, but it's something that we have to be aware of too. So when framing your scene, there's lots of different composition techniques you have at your disposal, and these are just some of the techniques that I used to compose my scenes. So one of which, and one that's fairly well known by most people who have done anything to do with photography, is the rule of thirds. And that's where you will aim to shoot your subject. You can either go for, in this example, it's a pretty extreme example, but 1/3 land and 2/3 sky. Where that works well is if you've got a really amazing and interesting sky happening above, you might want to accentuate the sky and sort of decrease the sort of the focus on the land. Also, you can deliberately choose to put your subject on the intersection of one of these grids, and that just provides a much more interesting and balanced shot than plonking something straight in the middle. Sometimes you're forced to into a certain composition because where you're standing, you can't move, from side to side if you're on the edge of a cliff or something. But for the most part, the more you can frame things to kind of fall onto these grid lines, the more interesting your composition will be. And you can also turn pretty much all cameras should have the functionality where you can turn your rule of thirds grid on in your viewfinder, so that when you're composing your image, you can actually see where things are in relation to that rule of thirds. I always have mine turned on. Now, another slightly more tricky and unique one is what's known as the golden triangle. It's a little bit like the rule of thirds, but it's a little bit more complex in that I have to say it's a bit of an obscure one, and one that sort of, if I've ever found that I've got a shot that fits this, it's probably more by accident than by good planning. It's where you sort of draw a diagonal line across your frame from one side to the other. It can either go that way or that way. And then you draw two lines up from the opposing sides, and where they meet in the middle is basically where you've sort of meant to have your subject point. So that's a kind of an example there, the Mauriki boulders down in Otago there. But yeah, it's a slightly more obscure one, and you might find it's not actually that easy to compose with that in mind, and it might just happen by accident from time to time. Leading lines. Now this is I'm a huge fan of leading lines. Leading lines are great. I would use them. I do use them a lot in my scenes, and they are great for long exposures, because if you turn up at a jetty somewhere, you can do a really long exposure and have some cool stuff going on in the sky, and the jetty to be a nice sort of subject leading you in. But leading lines don't always have to be straight. You can have waves in your foreground that are leading lines. You can have sort of curves of roads. You can have anything, and like I said, they don't have to be straight, but they do need to lead your eye into the shot. Then you've also got framing and symmetry. You can use what's in nature to frame your shot. In this example here, you've got obviously the forest here is providing a frame to the waterfall. You've also got symmetry going on. Now, it's not actually that common that you can find a waterfall reflection, because generally waterfalls have a lot of moving water around. So I was quite taken with, this is a waterfall just out east of Auckland called Hanua Falls, and I was quite gobsmacked. I'd never been here before. I turned up here late one afternoon, and I just couldn't believe that the river was still enough to create a waterfall reflection. And so that's one of these lovely times where you end up with multiple composition techniques happening, both with framing of the forest and the symmetry in the water as well there. And in fact, you'll see as well the river's basically creating a leading line that leads up to the waterfall as well. So if you can find yourself using more than one of these techniques in a shot, then it's obviously a bit of a bonus. then patterns and textures. I mean, we can take advantage of what naturally presents itself in nature. And in this particular shot here, I'm going to talk about this one a little bit later in terms of short and long exposures, but this particular shot, I was really intrigued. Actually, I'll say I was intrigued. I was actually really annoyed when I turned up to this to Cathedral Cove to shoot this shot, this sunrise, because there were so many sand patterns happening on the beach that it wasn't really giving me these perfect reflections. I was kind of hoping that as the tide rolled in and rolled out again, that I'd be getting this nice wet sand with this perfect reflection of the rock. But instead, there was just all these messy sand patterns everywhere. So in the end, I was like, well, I might as well make it work for me. And so I just decided to almost use them as a feature in this particular scene. You know, rather than kind of getting annoyed with the fact I couldn't get my perfect reflections. So yeah, there's always patterns and textures to be found in nature if we look around. So foreground interest, and that's where we need to endeavour to use something in our foreground again to draw our viewer into the frame. Now in this particular, you know, you can use anything for foreground interest. You can use rocks, you can use grass, you can use flowers, you can use a fence, you can use, you know, anything that's close up in your scene, you can use as foreground interest. Now, if you can just imagine for a moment that fern wasn't there and you just had this, you know, big expanse of water, I don't think it would be nearly as interesting as the fern sort of almost a little bit mysteriously hiding a little bit of the waterfall, and you kind of want to kind of look behind to get a better view of that waterfall there. So using foreground interest to draw somebody's eye through your scene from foreground to background is a really good way of adding a composition there. Then negative space. So there's also times where less is more. You know, I guess because I love wide open spaces, negative space maybe comes quite naturally, but this is a estuary down in the very bottom of the South Island in the Catlins, and I was driving actually between a lighthouse and a waterfall, and I went a back road and I was just driving down this gravel road, and I just came upon the scene and I stopped the car, I just left the door open, just grabbed my camera and just went and stood on the side of this estuary. I just loved just the simplicity of those rolling hills with the different colours of them, perfect reflections, and just the whispers of cloud and things. And so you don't have to fill your shot with as many things as you know, you can just keep it simple sometimes too and go with less is more. So focal lengths. This is another important kind of lesson to learn, and particularly noticeable when you're at somewhere like a jetty, but I think it's very sorry, I missed focal lengths. Hang on, I don't know, I think I might have had okay, I had something about focal lengths, and I don't have a picture to show it because this one's actually the next one, which is talking about hider shots. But focal lengths, obviously if you're shooting with a zoom lens, you've got different focal lengths available to you. It can be really easy to get very stuck in the mud and just stick with the one composition that you're quite liking, particularly if, you know, if it's around sunrise and sunset and you're getting some lovely shots. But, you know, don't forget to zoom out or zoom in, or even swap a lens. Particularly at Lake Matheson down in the South Island, I shot a lot with my wide angle, and it wasn't until way later after sunrise that I put my telephoto on and I zoomed right into the mountains and got some really cool shots of the peaks with this sort of misty cloud around them. And yeah, it's pretty easy just to go, oh, the view I've got is the best view. But yeah, try something different, change your focal length up and just see what happens. Yeah, as I said, this one here was about the height of your shots. Now, I think when we first start out as photographers, we tend to take a lot of stuff at eye level because it's convenient. You don't have to be uncomfortable, bent down, or, you know, crunched over your tripod or whatever. But the height of your shots can actually make a huge difference to the look of your image. You'd probably look at these shots here and say that they were taken, you know, one was a much more zoomed in shot, but in fact they're actually both taken at 23, 24 mil, so very wide angle. But from the difference being that this one is taken at head height and this one is taken very low down on the jetty to allow the jetty to become a real feature and to take up more of the scene, and it creates a completely different feel to the image. The other thing is about look behind you. Not a horror movie, but often at sunrise and sunset, it can be really tempting just to shoot towards the sun, because it sort of seems to be where all the action is and all the colour. But if you do look, if you're shooting somewhere where you can look behind you, make sure you do, because often there can be some beautiful reverse hues going on behind you that you can also shoot if you have the ability to compose something in both directions. So I just wanted to go through now specifically some long exposure examples. So in this shot here, this is taken sort of fairly local to me here in the Waikato. You can actually see here there's a fair amount of cloud movement in the sky after a minute, yet the trees here are relatively still. And that's because there was that sort of upper atmosphere wind that I was talking about, where the clouds are moving just enough to show some movement, yet there wasn't actually a whole heap of wind down at ground level, which, you know, enabled these to stay relatively still. And the use of the road here is another one of those sort of leading lines drawing you into the scene, looking up towards that hill with the light on it. Shooting a wave action at a beach like this one, this is Tunnel Beach down in Dunedin. This is always fun for long exposures because you actually get the benefit of both what's happening in the sky and also the water here. So after 30 seconds, your waves are turning into a real sort of swirling, foaming mess, and that can look really quite cool and artistic too. So using the flow of a river and a forest is another time when you can create a really lush look to a scene. But again, wind can be a challenge in scenes like this, and it's probably not terribly easy to see from these examples, but the shot on the left here is a pretty still day. There was really no wind whatsoever. So at 10 seconds, everything looks very still and very sharp. Whereas the shot on the right here, shot at 15 seconds, and I can see that there's some movement in the trees and there's certainly movement in the grass in the foreground there. So it has introduced some blurriness. Now, sometimes a little bit of blurriness is, okay, as long as it's not detracting from, the overall look and feel of your scene. And another challenge when shooting in long exposures in water and scenes like this is to not allow your water to get too blown out with the highlights. You can see here in the shot on the left, it's probably almost marginal. I mean, it's an artistic effect. You could argue that you quite like a lot of white. I don't like to have so much white that it sort of overpowers what's actually happening in the river, whereas the shot on the left is a little bit more balanced. Shot on the right is a little bit more balanced there in terms of how much sort of white is sort of happening in the water. Sometimes you can't really control that, because if there's a heck of a lot of flow coming down a river, you'll find that you just have to almost shoot shorter so that it doesn't become so overblown with your highlights. Forest scenes are great for using composition techniques like the framing that I was talking about before, because they usually, sort of both sides of a river, and it usually provides a nice sort of green canopy on either side to frame that sort of movement that's happening through the middle with the river there. Sometimes even a very short long exposure will suffice if the flow of water is sufficient. So Maricopa Falls, which is also it's about an hour and a half away from where I live, is probably one of the most powerful flows of water, any waterfall in New Zealand, and so you really don't need at all to do much of a long exposure to take advantage of it. This is only 1.6 seconds, but even at 1.6 seconds, it was still long enough to pick up some foreground movement in these leaves here, and partly that's because the waterfall was creating its own wind. I know that sounds funny, but it was true. Often if you've got a really powerful waterfall, it sort of it's pushing the air around it so much that it creates its kind of own sort of mini atmosphere. So that's just something to be aware of around waterfalls as well. Versus this shot here, similar shutter speed, sort of a second long, but it was a perfectly still little grotto where I was here, and there was really no movement going on. But 1 second in this instance was still long enough to get that lovely sort of silky flow going on with the waterfall there. Now the beach and I was talking about beach scenes before, but a beach scene is somewhere that suits both quite short long exposures or long ones. There's really no right or wrong here, and it's just creates a completely different effect. You've got a shot taken at 0.8 of a second, And that's because I was actually trying to capture some of the white water kind of as it sort of rushed in. I quite like trying to shoot sort of waves as they're sort of coming in and hitting like logs or rocks and things, because you kind of sometimes get that little splash happening, which can look really quite unique. It's usually about take 50 and get one good shot when you're trying to do shots like that. Whereas this is obviously a much longer one at 30 seconds, and this has enabled that water to be completely smoothed out. So yeah, just a very different effect. There's no right or wrong, and ultimately you get to decide based on the conditions that present themselves when you go somewhere. It might be that you go somewhere and go, it's actually a long exposure morning, or you might turn up and go, you know what, it's not a long exposure morning based on what I've got here. I'm going to just go with shorter exposures. And yeah, ultimately you can actually do both. You can do both in the same shoot and get very different results, and it means that you've got more more variety to play with. I do want to go back to the point I had on the first slide around long exposures. So of course there are some challenges. One of those, of course, is the fact that getting sharp focus and the correct exposure is more tricky with standard shots. But if you do use the tools that you have, i.e. manual focusing if you need to, and using an app to calculate your exposure, these are both, those two challenges are both reasonably easy to overcome. The other risk with taking a long exposure is that you can actually miss the moment altogether. So let's just picture the scene. For example, the sky is kicking off big time in this amazing display, and you're like, yes, I'm going to use a long exposure to capture this. So you set your camera up, for a long exposure. I'm going to go for 3 minutes long, and it's during the best color, and you find it only lasts a couple of minutes. And then for whatever reason, you find you've either over or underexposed, or your shot wasn't focused, and then you've just blown your chance to get the shot. So you do always have to balance your desire with, long exposure photography with the reality of the timing. Often what I do is I'll use a long exposure very early on in sunrise, like for example here when it was blue hour, like well before sunrise, to shoot long exposures while it's still relatively dark. And then as it gets closer and closer to the actual sunrise, I'll shorten my exposures so that if I don't get the shot quite right, I've actually got more than one opportunity to try. There's nothing worse than shooting for 5 minutes to create a banger image and then finding you've messed up some component of it. Don't get me wrong, I love long exposures, but I do think there's a time and a place for shooting the very long exposures. And you do have to weigh up the benefits versus the potential cost of potentially missing the moment. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, the other thing, there's sometimes a bit of an unintended consequence of shooting long exposures, and that's what's known as hot pixels. Now, this is what's caused, it's caused by electrical charges that leak into the sensor wells, and they get worse and appear more frequently when the sensor is hot. And obviously your sensor gets hotter if you've got your shutter open for a very long period of time. They're very normal and they'll show up on any camera. So don't worry that you've got something wrong with your camera if you do see them on your images. So how can you, and this is just a little wee example here, you can see all these pretty coloured dots all over my picture, greens, pinks, etc. So how can you prevent this? Well, there's 2 or 3 options available to you. One of which is you can use, most cameras will have what's known as long exposure noise reduction. And after taking an image with it, if you have that setting turned on, basically your camera will take a duplicate image called a dark frame. So it's exactly the same image as the settings that you've just used for your actual image, but it's taken as though the lens cap is on. And so when that dark frame is complete, the camera compares it with the original frame you've taken and subtracts the noise it finds. It's a very effective way of making your images more usable and not have any hot pixels. However, the downside is you've got to wait twice as long to be able to take your next shot, because if you've just shot a 5-minute long exposure and then your camera does its 5-minute long dark frame, you've just waited for 10 minutes and you've probably missed the entire sunrise in the process. So that's way too long in some circumstances. Now, the second option is for you to take your own dark frame, but you do need to do this basically around about the same time as what you're shooting, because dark frames only work when they've got exactly the same setting, i.e. the same shutter, aperture, ISO, and they also need to be kind of in the same ambient environment. Don't ask me why, probably very scientific, but yeah, you do need to do them roughly at the same time that you're doing your shot. So it might be that you're shooting for half an hour and the conditions are quite similar, temperature's not changing too much, then you could probably just take a dark frame at the end of that. But if, say for example, you forget and you go home and then you try and do it, it's probably not going to even be worth doing. So the third thing you can do, and that seems to be my choice when it comes to fixing it, is just to fix it in post-processing, because when you come to find it later down the track, you can't do a heck of a lot about it. And you're like, I actually only found this image that I've been referring to, this image here with the cave. Somebody actually purchased that, and I was doing my sort of QA that I tend to do before sending it off to the printer, and I shot this shot maybe 4 years ago, and I had no idea there was even any hot pixels in the image. I'd never zoomed into 100% to even look, and I was horrified and thought, what on earth am I going to do? Because I don't really want to go through and take out, I don't know, 300 or so individual hot pixels using the spot removal tool. So I had to Google what to do with hot pixels, and there's actually a process in Photoshop, which I'm going to show you when we edit this image, where you select noise, dust and scratches, and I think you'll agree that it did a pretty good job of getting rid of them. So I'll show you that for real when we come to edit the image. So moving on to editing. So today we're going to edit 3 images, just to sort of show you how to maximize the potential of your raw images to create beautiful art. Now, you might already be a Lightroom user, you might prefer Photoshop. Either way, you can achieve the same result. I do tend to be a heavy Lightroom user. I think it's a lot easier to understand when you're just starting out with editing. I'm well aware of the fact there's far more powerful features available in Photoshop, and I do use it for things like focus stacking and star trails and things like that. But for the most part, if I'm editing single images, and these are all single images we're doing today, just to keep things simple, then Lightroom does a pretty good job. So here are the 3 before and after of the images we're going to edit. The first one is this scene, this picture you'll be quite familiar with because it was on the original intro slide. So this is that sort of 2-minute long exposure at Cathedral Cove. We're also going to edit a shorter waterfall exposure. You'll see here that though the flow of the waterfall's been captured at 3 seconds, the clouds still look relatively, what I would say, normal, and not, you know, they're not sort of rushing around like they are in some of the other images. And then the last one we're going to do is a long exposure at Lake Wanaka. This one was nicely showing some cloud movement after sort of a minute. And this was one of those slightly challenging shots where it wasn't particularly still, which also is really frustrating when you're a landscape photographer and you want reflections at lakes. And there was lots of ducks swimming around, and ducks are really painful. They're great when they're staying still, but not when they're moving backwards and forwards through your images and you're trying to shoot long exposures. So I shot this at, I think it was nearly a minute long, and it basically got rid of all the duckies because they were just gliding around and they just kind of disappeared through the process of the long exposure. And this was also one of the rare moments when I have, you can see here that's actually was shot with my long lens. I'm sure this tree needs no introduction, apart from it doesn't quite look like it used to because it's some horrible person sawed off the bottom branch back in March while we were in lockdown. Yes, but the Wanaka tree is a very, very popular place to photograph. And the shoreline, which is sort of down the side here, any given morning you might find 20 or 30 photographers there. It's probably the most popular place in New Zealand when it comes to having to share your spot with other photographers. And yeah, I was getting a little bit annoyed with the fact that I couldn't get good compositions because people were standing in the lake and just generally not being particularly, what's the word? Thoughtful to others. So I went right around the other side of the lake here, and I just shot directly across the lake with my long lens, and I quite liked the composition I got anyway, so all was well. But yeah, let's crack into this editing. I just have to stop sharing for a moment so I can get my Lightroom up, and then share again. And I think hopefully, I think that should be good. Okay. If you give me a nod, if everyone's now seeing my Lightroom, hopefully they are. Cool, cool. All right, let's kick into this. Oopsie daisy. Right, okay. So, as I said, I've got some before and afters that I'm kind of working to, but I'm basically going to edit this as if I was editing it from scratch. So, first things first, I obviously, with the amount of time we have today, I'm not going to have time to kind of go through what each of the adjustments does, but hopefully you'll kind of get the hang of it as we're going through it. And if I mean, some of it's fairly self-explanatory. Anything that's not particularly obvious, I'll kind of explain what it is and what we're doing. But obviously exposure is brightening the image. I'm just going to bring it up to about 120. Add a little bit of contrast in. Now, shadows is a pretty big one. Obviously, you can see how black that cave is. So we'll start at about 65, 2/3 there. One of the things I do tend to do, I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but more often than not, I'm pulling my highlights right down and I'm bringing my shadows right up. And usually I'll have them fairly well balanced. So if I'm minus 100 with my highlights, I'll be plus 100 with my shadows. I'm just going to add a little bit more blacks into there, not a whole lot, and a bit of clarity. So obviously that just sort of sharpens the image a little bit there. You're probably not going to get to see it kind of develop until I start doing a lot of the kind of color adjustments. But obviously I'm just going to add a bit of vibrance in there now, just to start making the most of that. Now, I do use color adjustments quite a lot in my images, and that's because I want to kind of make the most of the colors that were already there in the scene. I'm just going to, and this tone curve is a slightly more sort of individual way of, rather than doing sort of global, it kind of allows you just to kind of only pull out the light tones from the image rather than exposure, which was increasing everything. Just pull those up a bit, and the darks as well, and some shadows in the tone curve. Yeah, so as I said, you can do it on a global basis, or you can also use your tone curve to be a bit more specific there as well. So where this will really start to pop, those where you start bringing in your color tones. So there's obviously some, I don't tend to use, now with this you can actually use it on an individual basis. I prefer to have mine all out like this, and I just have it, so I'm kind of looking at both the saturation and the luminance. Hue tends to very much change how the image looks, whereas I just want to increase the vibrancy and the brightness of a particular color tone. So I'm going to increase the blues because it was blue hour, so I might as well make the most of those, and increase the purples as well. And often what I will find what I'll do with an image is I'll actually just play around with the different colors and kind of see if I can see anything changing. So it's probably not that obvious. There's a little bit of yellow in the cliff over here, and a little bit of orange as well. There's not many, it's not much in that image. It is mostly sort of blues and purples. And then I'm quite a big fan of using luminance. Luminance is basically the brightness of a color. So you can see here, if I do that hugely, that's completely, brightening up the blue, that's completely darkening it. Now, where that can be quite useful is if you're just trying to make your blues pop in your sky, it's just to play around with your luminance a little bit. I'm just going to bring that down a little bit there. There's not a whole heap going on in these, but sometimes, yeah, you can kind of, I can see that move, I can see that changing in the cliff a little bit. So I'm just going to bring, the other thing, it's not terribly obvious, but the orange luminance is actually increasing the light on the side of the rock there as well. At this point, I know that I did actually turn around and change my change my white balance to cloudy at that point, because I was actually trying to bring out more So as it was shot, it was quite a cool shot. So you see it was down there at 5350, and by changing the white balance, I mean, I could have done that manually, but changing the white balance to cloudy has just brought a bit more sort of purpley and just reduced the blue hues a little bit there. Often I'll find when I'm doing adjustments as well that I won't just touch a slider once. I'll actually go back to it, and once I've done other things and actually sort of muck around with it a bit more. And there's obviously infinite ways you can edit an image, which is the beauty of Lightroom. And the other beauty of it as well is, hopefully if you're all familiar with it, you can see down the left hand side here, these are all of the adjustments that I've done. Now at any point, if I don't like where I've got to, I can actually just click back to there, and if I started making adjustments now, everything that happened after that would just get erased. So like I was talking about before with the raw and JPEGs, you've got that non-destructive editing where you can I see here where I've just I hit the reset button, so now I've got a million things that I've been working on anyway. I'm going to go back to where I was, otherwise we'll lose all those adjustments. Yeah, and the other thing as well is if you're really unhappy with where you've got to with an image, you can just hit the reset button and start all over again. So yeah, you kind of got, that's the beauty of Lightroom and using raw files, that you can edit things a million different ways. And down the bottom here, you can see how I've got two files that are effectively the same. I just did a virtual copy. So you just right click and go create virtual copy. And if you kind of like, excuse me, an edit that you've done, but you want to try something different, but you don't want to kind of lose where you're at, you can just create a virtual copy and then make changes to your original one, and you've still always got that copy available to you that you can kind of use as your final version if you don't like your other one. So I'm getting a bit distracted here telling you all these other things. Where am I? So the dehaze button here, I don't know if you can see that. I mean, if I go hard out, you can see how horrific it looks, but just adding a tiny bit of dehaze into a shot can sometimes just make your colors pop a little bit. Excuse me. The other thing I want to do here is I just kind of want to get rid of that horrible patch of sand there. I could use a spot removal and get rid of that log, but I'm just going to be lazy and crop it out altogether. And then just double check as well. It's interesting when you're shooting in the field how you can often feel like you're really, really straight. You can either use the auto button. I don't know sure if I actually really agree with that. I feel like or you can obviously just click on it now. See, I don't really agree with what it gave me for auto. I don't think it was quite, I think that's a bit better. Just cropping again to avoid that. So yeah, so this is probably roughly how I would have kind of finished with that shot. I don't know if it's possibly not exactly the same as what I had, but it's probably not far off. And then obviously I was talking to you about those hot pixels. So we want to be able to get rid of those, because you'd look at that shot and go, it's perfectly fine. But when you zoom in to 100%, you can see all of those yucky pixels hanging around on my shot. So if I go edit in Photoshop, now I've just realized that I didn't have Photoshop open, sorry. So that's probably going to take its sweet time thinking about opening up. And I'm probably going to have to also stop sharing my screen to switch over to Photoshop. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, I am. Stop share and share again. Where are we? Is it this one? Oh, Photoshop, there we go. So when you come into Photoshop, as I said, there's this tool here called Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches. So what I want to do is I want to get my preview and find somewhere that's got a whole lot of these pixels so that it's going to be really obvious when I'm editing. I'm just going to zoom in a bit so that makes it a little bit easier for you guys to see. Oh, there you go. So there you can see they're pretty big. Now, oops, they're not, because I've got turned this off. Oh, I'll just leave it. Okay, so there with a radius of 1, you can still see the spot. So the goal here is just basically to increase the radius by the smallest amount possible. And I found that 3 worked pretty well to get rid of it. And then you also want to adjust the threshold. So the lower you go, the more I think the more obvious, yeah, it's a really fine balance as well between getting it, getting it right, and also because introducing this noise, dust and scratches actually does de-sharpen your image a little bit, so you definitely don't want that to happen too much. Actually, I'm just going to change it to 4. Yeah, and so once you just basically have to play around with those settings, and once you're pretty happy that those spots have all disappeared, then you can obviously hit OK, and then you can save and close that back down into Lightroom. Now, when you edit raw files in Photoshop, or if you go from Lightroom and go edit in Photoshop and then save and close them back, they'll always come back not as a raw file, but as a TIFF. Well, certainly mine is set up that way to come back as a TIFF file. So that's just something to be aware of. They're no longer a completely raw file. So if you are wanting to do any kind of minor adjustments, like doing cloning out things in Photoshop, it's something that's always best to do at the very end, once you've completed all your other sort of adjustments in Lightroom. Obviously, if you do full edits in Photoshop, it's no problem, but because I tend to edit in Lightroom and flick across only as and when I need to, I usually save any of those last minute things that I need to do in Photoshop until I've pretty much got my completed image. Now, you would say that I'm just going to close out of there. It's going to probably stop sharing and go back into sharing again to Lightroom. I'm not going to need that again, so just go back into there. There we go. Yeah, so you would say in this particular image, you can see how I've still got some shadow clipping going on in the cave there. Now, I'm actually okay with that in this example, because I actually feel it kind of suits the mood of the scene. You've almost got a natural vignette happening, or that sort of darkening of the edges of your photo, purely because you've got that cave on either side. More often than not, I'm not super happy about having like full black in my scenes, but some scenes suit it, and in this particular one I think it does. But I think what's more important is that there's no highlight clipping. There's nothing that's too bright in that image, so it's a pretty balanced scene. So that is the first one. I can see I'm slightly running behind time, so I'll have to stop talking too much. This next one, the waterfall one, this is not a particularly difficult one to do. First things first, obviously, if I looked at that, I'd be like, I clearly wasn't taking this shot very straight. I would really prefer my waterfall to be straight up and down if possible. And then wanting to increase my exposure. And again, as I said, reduce the highlights. If you see as I'm reducing the highlights, you're getting more color or more definition back into that sky, and just reducing some of the darkness with the shadows. But I do want to just bring a few more contrasting blacks back into the darker areas. And straight away I want to obviously make this a little bit more vibrant. And that's the thing with raw files. You do have to, it's very rare that you can come into a raw file and not touch some form of color adjustment, whether it be a global one like vibrance or individual colors as well. Now, this is the reason I picked this one as well, is because waterfall scenes are great to edit, I think, because there's you can really make things look very lush just by sort of changing the greens. Both the green saturation, and if you notice what happens with the luminance, if you can see here, if I push that luminance right up, how bright those greens become. So it's a way of really making your greens stand out in your sort of those sort of foresty scenes. Now, back at school, we were all taught about our blues and yellows. Blue and yellow makes green. So you'll find too, when you're editing waterfall scenes, that there's a lot of yellow contained in your forest. That's sort of almost a hidden color. So you can see as so not only is the color changing here in the pool, but as I'm changing that yellow luminance, there's actually parts of the forest that are brightening up as well. Now with the sorry, I'm just going to try and move my I've got my videos right smack bang over the middle of the bit I'm trying to edit, which is not very helpful. So with the blue, obviously wanting to make the blue in the sky stand out a little bit more, And this is where I was telling to you about how you can really change the luminance, the brightness of the sky. Obviously that looks very, very fake, but you can often just introduce a little bit of darkness into your blue luminance to make your sky pop a little bit. Now at this point, just add a little bit of clarity in as well to sharpen the whole image up. There's probably only 2 more things that I would do to this image. I'm reasonably happy with the colors and things. One of those is, I don't know if you can tell, but the top of the waterfall is not as bright as the bottom of the waterfall. So I'm going to introduce what's known as a radial filter. Now across the top here, you've obviously got all your different adjustments, basic and things we've been using. We've basically just been using the basic and the colors here. But you've also got what's known as the spot removal, which we're going to cover off in the next one. Red eye correction, I never use. Crop, spot removal. Then you've got a graduated filter. And that's basically where you can just introduce lines I'm going to be using that one. I might be using that one in the next one. But radial introduces a round filter. So you've got the ability then to just edit a particular portion of your image. And for this one, I want to actually brighten up that top half of the waterfall. So I'm just going to add some highlights, and you can see how it's getting a lot lighter. And increase the shadows a little bit as well. And the whites just going to brighten up that part of the waterfall. Now you can obviously, with a radial filter, you can make it as long or as skinny as you want. You can make it as fat as you want, as wide as you want. And then obviously that it works well if you've got something like this where, I mean, I could use an adjustment brush as well, but because it's kind of a longer section, the radial filter works quite well, and that's just brightened up that top part of the waterfall. The last thing I'd want to do here is just, I think you'll kind of agree that this top section here is quite dark. And for that, I just want to add in a little bit of increase the exposure. With your adjustment brush, this is where you're basically just brushing on the adjustment you want to make. That brush is a bit big, so I'm just going to reduce the size of it down the bottom here. Oh, it's still quite big. I think it's because the feather is, what's going on with it there. So by just brushing on, I'm just brushing over and increasing. So if you can see how that works if I take it up really, really high, but I'm only going to do a little bit. Now, if you found that you had sort of overcooked it, and you can see here, I wasn't particularly exact with my, I could obviously, I would have, if I had more time, I'd be zooming in and doing this on a much smaller scale, which you can do by going Control+. You can zoom right into where you're editing. You just go back into that adjustment brush and fix it what looks horrific. There we go. So you can bring it down there. Now, if you find that you're reasonably happy, but you see there's a little bit that you weren't that great on, you can just actually use the eraser and erase over the bits that might have just kind of gone out to the side that you didn't want there. I'll just zoom back out of there. It's still actually way too bright, so I'm just gonna, whoops, bring it back to more like that. So yeah, so now it's just brightened up that top part of the image there, and I'd be reasonably happy with that as a finished product. Now, if you are wanting to look, I mean, obviously you won't always have the before and after like I have, because I've made copies. The backslash, I always get confused, is it backslash or forward? Backslash key. Backslash key is your quick and easy go-to to go before and after, so you can kind of see where you're at with your adjustments. The other thing you can do as well is you can just do it side by side. So that little button I just clicked on here cycles before and after. You can do it like you can split screen. You can do it many different ways. To be honest, I actually prefer, I'm going to take that off, go back to how it was. Yeah, so I actually just prefer doing the before and after key like that, just to kind of see where I started and where I've ended up. So last image, bear with me, I know we're kind of cracking on time wise, is this Lake Wanaka one, and I've just lost my phone's gone on to screensaver. So again, with this one, a lot of similar things here. We're going to obviously increase the exposure. Again, I've said it's like one of those things. The first thing I always do is highlights down and shadows up. Not always exactly 100, but just whatever the scene suits. And again, like I said, I will always be adding, adding some vibrance and things into this image. Now, before we go too far, this is not looking anything like my finished example, and that's because for whatever reason, it was shot on a very, very cool setting. So I'm going to increase it up to about 6,000. And also I'm going to increase the purple. If you get to know my photography well, you know I'm a big fan of pinks and purples. So a lot of my work is quite heavily influenced by those colour tones. And what else am I going to do? And add a little bit of dehaze in as well. And I might even increase the saturation a little bit on this one. Saturation is basically a very much harsher version of the vibrance. I don't tend to use it a lot because I feel like vibrance in itself is quite enough. But yeah, we've definitely got some more work to do to try and really pull out some of the nice colours that were in the scene. So this is where I want to actually just draw on some of the colours. So you can see by increasing the reds, it's brought in a bit more colour and light through what's hitting the mountains there. The orange saturation will bring a bit more colour into the trees over here, and same with the yellow. Probably be a bit more obvious once I lighten it up. And a little bit of magenta because there's a bit of pinks going on in the sky there. And then it's also about just mucking around with the brightness of those colours that we've adjusted. So particularly with the oranges, if you notice in the trees here, once I increase the brightness of those, it really starts to make these trees here sort of stand out a bit more. And same with the yellows as well. You can see the yellows in the trees, if I put it right up to 100, is really kind of getting a bit more of a feature. And greens, no, it's not a lot happening in the greens. So because this image is quite bright around the edges, unlike the last two, which were both quite dark around the edges, I would be adding what's known as a vignette, which is down here, right down here in effects. And I would be always doing this if I had an image that's kind of bright around the outside, because what that does is it allows your eyes to draw into the middle of the scene. Now, pretty happy with that, except for I don't really love the trees over here. They're still a bit dark and also a little bit messy. And looking at this crop, I actually want to crop this scene so that my tree is a bit more on my rule of thirds line, which I was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to bring that crop in, so you can see now that tree is kind of hitting that intersection of the rule of thirds, and I've kind of got rid of this dead space of these trees on the left hand side there. But again, I kind of still think it kind of looks a bit weird how these ones are quite bright and these ones are quite dark. So I'm just going to add a radial filter into the trees here, and whoops, just lighten those up a little bit. And then I could either use another radial filter, or I'm actually just going to use a little bit of an adjustment brush over the middle of those trees there, just to, oops, brighten them up, but not too much. Okay, so yeah, so there's obviously quite a few different techniques between doing individual color adjustments, doing adjustments based on using filters, and using different, being able to just kind of hone on a particular part of the image. The one thing I'm not going to fix, and if you've got a keen eye for detail, you'll have noticed how many horrible spots are on this image. It was just before I got my sensor cleaned, and they are everywhere. I'm actually just going to fix the crop of this because it's quite wonky. Now, suffice to say, if you use Lightroom, you all know how to get rid of your spots. But just a quick little tip, if you're not aware of it, is to use the Visualize Spots feature, just a little button down here. And what that does is, if you've got spots in very obvious places, like, for example, here in the lake, it actually really highlights them and makes them easy to find. I won't tell you the number of times I've gone to, export a shot or put it on Instagram and discover that there's a horrible spot that I didn't pay any attention to when I was editing. So that's always a useful tool to use. And the way to use the spot removal tool is basically just to zoom in so we can actually see some of these spots. I'll only do one because otherwise we'll be here all night. It's basically just to click on there, and it basically is, it's pretty clever, Lightroom. It will find somewhere in the image where it thinks it's similar and replace it with. It works really well if you're just doing skies or lakes like this. It doesn't work so well if you're trying to clone to remove things that are funny shapes. That's where the clone removal tool in Photoshop does a much better job. We don't really have time to go over that tonight, unfortunately, but that's just a way you can get rid of fairly easy spots in your shots. And that is pretty much sort of a start to finish on that edit. So I'm just going to flick back over to my presentation now. I've still got it somewhere, maybe this one. Oh, there we go. And oops. Yeah, so that's kind of reached the official end of the session. Obviously wanted to say thanks for your interest in wanting to create long exposures. I hope you've learned some new skills and techniques that you can take with you into your sort of next photography shoot. Just a reminder that obviously you've got access to a 10% discount for any purchase with case filters between now and the 9th of September. Which is a couple of weeks away. And obviously very happy to chat through your specific requirements if you've got any questions about what will and won't work for your setup. There's obviously a number of different ways that you can connect with me after this if you want to keep connecting. So I obviously these are all my social media handles here, Facebook and Instagram, my website. If you're keen to learn more, I do run landscape photography weekend workshops throughout New Zealand. Obviously travel is a bit of an issue at the moment if you're overseas, but it's something definitely something to bear in mind if you happen to be in New Zealand in the future. I also have a 5-week online photography course that I've been running this year. I've had about 50 people complete that, and some of what we went over tonight is in the course, but there's obviously much more contained in there as well. So yes, thank you very much for your participation and interest. And yeah, I've got a few people saying thank you too for being involved, and yeah, if you've got any questions, I'm happy to stick around for the next sort of 10-15 minutes if people have anything they'd like to ask, and if you yeah, if anybody's got anything in specific. Otherwise I will make sure that my email is in the and is what goes out with the George's information, so you can email me directly there with anything specific, because I know sometimes it can be a little bit daunting asking questions in the group forum, and you don't want to monopolize people's time. So yeah, you're welcome to contact me after the event as well. But yeah, I'll just give it a couple more seconds, and if no one has any more things they want to jump in with the chat, then we can say adieu. And you guys have probably still got if you're in Australia, you've probably still got a little bit of your evening. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Someone says thank you, I feel far more confident, so that is awesome. Yeah, it's about 11 o'clock here in New Zealand, so I'll be hopefully heading straight to bed, although I often find after running these online courses it takes me a little bit of time to unwind, so I might just have to go and have a hot cup of tea or something and zone out to some TV for half an hour. Midday in the UK. Oh yes, we do have someone international here. That's cool. Well, you get to enjoy the rest of your day then. So yeah, but yeah, no, so awesome to have you all here. And like I said, please feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions. It's really, really cool to see so many of you on here. Very honoured that you chose to spend your evening with me. So yeah, all the best everybody, and have a lovely evening, and I will hopefully catch you on another online course, or maybe one day here in New Zealand on a workshop too. All the best, and take care.